The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Aldermere Palace as Captain Marcus Thornfield adjusted his ceremonial sword and took his position at the main entrance. 20 years of service to the crown had taught him to read the subtle signs of trouble, and today those signs were everywhere. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. Princess Isabella, barely 16 years old, sat in the morning room picking at her breakfast while her governess, Mrs. Whitmore, attempted to review the day's schedule. The young princess's dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and her green eyes held the same defiant spark that had gotten her into trouble countless times before. She was the youngest child of King Edmund and Queen Vivian of Aldermere, a small but prosperous European kingdom known for its banking sector and picturesque mountain landscapes. "Your Highness, you have mathematics at 10, followed by diplomatic protocol at 11, Mrs. Whitmore said in her crisp voice, consulting her leather-bound planner. "Then, lunch with your parents and the Minister of Defense to discuss the security arrangements for next week's state visit." Isabella pushed her eggs around her plate without enthusiasm. "More security meetings. As if we don't have enough guards watching our every move already." She glanced toward the window where she could see 2 members of the Royal Guard patrolling the gardens. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to just walk down a street without someone following 3 steps behind." Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened slightly. She had been with the royal family for 8 years and had watched Isabella grow from a spirited child into a thoughtful young woman. "The protection is for your safety, Your Highness. These are uncertain times." The governess was referring to the growing unrest in the neighboring kingdom of Valdoria, where economic collapse had led to civil war. Thousands of refugees had crossed into Aldermere seeking safety, putting strain on resources and creating political tension. Additionally, intelligence reports suggested that extremist groups were planning something that could destabilize the entire region. Captain Thornfield's radio crackled to life, interrupting his morning routine. "Captain, we have movement at the North Gate. Unscheduled arrival." The voice belonged to Sergeant Davies, one of his most trusted men. "Copy that. Description?" Thornfield responded, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. "Black motorcycles, approximately 12 riders. They've stopped just outside the gate perimeter but haven't approached the checkpoint." Thornfield frowned. Motorcycle groups weren't uncommon in the area, but their timing seemed suspicious. The royal family was scheduled to attend a public ceremony later that week, and security protocols were already heightened. "Maintain observation. Do not engage unless they attempt to breach the perimeter." Inside the palace, Queen Vivian was having her own difficult morning. She sat across from her husband in his private study, reviewing intelligence briefings that painted an increasingly troubling picture. King Edmund, a man in his early 50s with graying temples and worry lines that had deepened over the past year, looked up from a classified report. "The situation in Valdoria is deteriorating faster than anyone predicted," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "Prime Minister Caldwell believes we may need to close our borders completely." Queen Vivian, elegant even in the early morning hours with her blonde hair pulled back in a simple chignon, shook her head. "We can't abandon the refugees, Edmund. These are families with children who have nowhere else to go. And our responsibility is to our own people first," the king replied, though his tone suggested he was struggling with the decision himself. "If we continue to allow unrestricted entry, we risk destabilizing our own economy and security." The queen leaned forward, her blue eyes intense. "What about Isabella? She's been asking questions about the refugees. She wants to visit the camps and see the conditions for herself." King Edmund's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. The security risk is too great, and, frankly, she's too young to understand the complexities of the situation." "She's 16, Edmund. At her age, I was already attending state functions and meeting with foreign dignitaries. We can't shelter her from the world forever." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Come in," the king called out. Captain Thornfield entered, his expression serious. "Your Majesties, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a developing situation that requires your attention." The Queen straightened in her chair. "What kind of situation, Captain?" There's a group of motorcyclists positioned just outside our security perimeter. They arrived approximately 20 minutes ago and have made no move to approach or leave. Additionally, we've received intelligence that suggests this may be connected to the anti-monarchy demonstrations that have been occurring in the capital. King Edmund stood up, his breakfast forgotten.
Anti-monarchy demonstrations? This is the first I'm hearing of this.
Thornfield hesitated for a moment. The Minister of Interior felt it was better to handle the situation quietly, Your Majesty. The demonstrations have been small and peaceful so far, but the rhetoric has been escalating.
What kind of rhetoric?
Queen Vivian asked, though from her tone, it was clear she dreaded the answer.
Calls for the dissolution of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic.
They blame the royal family for the economic strain caused by the refugee crisis.
There have also been some concerning social media posts suggesting that direct action may be necessary.
The king walked to the window and looked out at the palace grounds. Everything appeared normal, gardeners tending to the flower beds, guards at their posts, the morning routine proceeding as it had for decades. But he knew that appearances could be deceiving, especially in times of political upheaval.
Double the security around Isabella, he ordered.
And I want a full briefing on these demonstrations within the hour.
Already done, Your Majesty. However, there's another matter.
Thornfield paused, choosing his words carefully. Princess Isabella has requested permission to attend a charity event in the capital tomorrow evening.
Given the current situation, I would strongly advise against it.
Queen Vivian looked at her husband. They both knew how their daughter would react to being confined to the palace. Isabella had inherited her father's strong will and her mother's compassionate heart, a combination that often led to challenging situations. We'll discuss it with her, the Queen said finally. But, Captain, I want you to personally oversee her security detail.
If she does attend this event, I need your word that she'll be protected. You have it, Your Majesty.
As Thornfield left the study, neither the king nor queen could have anticipated how quickly the situation would escalate. Outside the palace walls, the motorcycle group had grown from 12 to nearly 30 riders. They weren't just random protesters, they were members of the Iron Wolves, a group that had started as motorcycle enthusiasts but had evolved into something much more dangerous. Their leader, Viktor Kozlov, was a former military officer from Valdoria who had lost everything in the Civil War. His wife and young son had died in a bombing raid, and he held the monarchies of the region responsible for failing to prevent the conflict. He had come to Aldermere with a specific purpose, and Princess Isabella was central to his plan. Back in the morning room, Isabella had finished her breakfast and was staring out the window at the gardens. She had noticed the increased security presence but hadn't thought much of it. Her life had always been surrounded by guards and protocols, so a few extra uniforms didn't seem significant.
Mrs. Whitmore, she said suddenly, what do you think it's really like for the refugee children? The ones living in the camps?
Her governess paused in her note-taking. I'm sure it's very difficult for them, Your Highness.
They've had to leave behind everything they knew. Father won't let me visit them. He says it's too dangerous.
Isabella's voice carried a note of frustration that was becoming more common as she grew older.
But how can I understand what our people are going through if I'm not allowed to see it for myself?
Your father's concern comes from love, Your Highness.
There are people who might want to use your compassion against you. Isabella turned from the window to face her governess. What do you mean?
Mrs. Whitmore realized she had said more than she should have.
Nothing, Your Highness.
I simply meant that public appearances require careful planning for security reasons.
But Isabella was too intelligent to accept such a vague explanation. Mrs. Whitmore, is there something happening that I should know about?
Everyone's been acting strange lately, and there are more guards than usual. Before her governess could respond, the sound of motorcycles grew louder, echoing off the palace walls. Isabella moved back to the window and saw the group of riders that had positioned themselves outside the gates. Even from this distance, she could see that they weren't simply passing through.
Who are they? She asked.
Mrs. Whitmore joined her at the window, her face pale.
I don't know, Your Highness, but
I think we should move away from the window." At that moment, Captain Thornfield's voice came over the palace intercom system.
"All personnel, this is a code yellow situation. Royal family members are to remain in secure locations until further notice."
This is not a drill. Isabella's heart began to race.
Code yellow meant a potential security threat.
She had heard the term used in drills but never in a real situation.
"Mrs. Whitmore, what's happening?"
"I'm sure it's just a precaution, Your Highness."
Captain Thornfield is very thorough about security protocols.
But, even as she spoke, Mrs. Whitmore was moving toward the door to ensure it was locked. She had been briefed on emergency procedures, and she knew that code yellow could escalate to code red very quickly if the situation deteriorated. Outside, Viktor Kozlov dismounted from his motorcycle and walked toward the palace gates. He carried no weapons, he was too smart for that, but his presence alone was enough to send ripples of concern through the royal guard. 2 guards approached him, their hands resting on their sidearms. "Sir, you're on restricted property." "I'm going to need you to move along," one of the guards said firmly. Viktor smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression.
"I'm not on your property, officer.
I'm standing on a public road, which is my right as a citizen of this kingdom."
"Sir, you and your group are causing a disruption. I'm asking you to disperse."
"I have a message for the royal family," Viktor said, his accent revealing his Valdorian origins.
"Tell them that the people of Valdoria have not forgotten. Tell them that justice will be served."
The guard's radio crackled as he called in the incident. Within minutes, Captain Thornfield himself appeared at the gate, flanked by 4 additional guards. His military bearing and stern expression made it clear that he was not a man to be trifled with. "I'm Captain Thornfield, head of palace security."
"State your business."
Viktor studied the captain carefully. He could see the intelligence in the man's eyes and the way his hand rested casually near his weapon.
This was a professional, not some ceremonial guard playing dress-up.
"My business is with the royal family, Captain.
They need to understand that their actions have consequences." "What actions would those be?"
Thornfield asked, buying time while he assessed the threat level. He could see that Viktor's followers were watching the exchange closely, and he noted several of them had positioned themselves in ways that could allow for a quick escape if necessary. The people of Valdoria are suffering because this kingdom and others like it failed to act when action could have made a difference. Now my people are refugees, begging for scraps while your royal family lives in luxury.
Thornfield nodded slowly.
"I understand your frustration, but threatening the royal family is not the way to address your concerns.
There are proper channels for political grievances."
Viktor's laugh was harsh and bitter.
"Proper channels?"
"My wife and son are dead because of proper channels."
"Sometimes direct action is the only language that power understands."
At that moment, Sergeant Davies approached the captain and whispered something in his ear.
Thornfield's expression darkened as he received the update.
Intelligence had confirmed that Viktor Kozlov was a person of interest in several incidents across Europe, including the bombing of a government building in France.
"Mr. Kozlov," Thornfield said, using the man's name deliberately to show that he was not dealing with an unknown quantity, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the area immediately.
Your presence here constitutes a threat to national security." Viktor's eyes narrowed. The fact that the captain knew his name meant they had been watching him, which complicated his plans. But he had come too far to turn back now. "I'll leave when I've delivered my message, Captain."
"Tell Princess Isabella that she has a choice to make.
She can continue to hide behind these walls while people suffer, or she can show the courage that royalty is supposed to represent."
With that, Viktor turned and walked back to his motorcycle.
As he and his followers prepared to leave, he called out one final message: "We'll be watching, Captain.
And, next time, we might not be so polite."
The motorcycles roared to life and disappeared down the mountain road, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust and a profound sense of unease.
Thornfield immediately ordered a full security review and increased patrols around the palace perimeter.
Inside the palace, Isabella had heard the motorcycles departing but had no way of knowing what had transpired. The code yellow alert was still in effect, and she was growing increasingly frustrated with being kept in the dark. "Mrs. Whitmore, I demand to know what's happening. Those motorcycles weren't just tourists, and everyone's acting like we're under siege." Her governess looked conflicted. She had strict instructions about what information could be shared with the princess, but she also understood the young woman's need to comprehend the gravity of the situation. "Your Highness, there are people who disagree with your family's policies regarding the refugee crisis. Sometimes those disagreements lead to demonstrations." "Demonstrations? Is that what this was?" Isabella's voice rose slightly. "And what does that have to do with me specifically?" Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. "Some people believe that members of the royal family, especially younger ones, should take more visible roles in addressing social issues." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. She had always known that being a princess came with responsibilities, but she was beginning to understand that it also came with risks she had never fully considered. "If people want me to take a more visible role, then why won't Father let me visit the refugee camps or attend public events?" "Because, Your Highness, there's a difference between taking on responsibilities in a controlled environment and exposing yourself to potential danger." As the afternoon wore on, the royal family gathered for an emergency meeting in the king's study. Present were King Edmund, Queen Vivian, Princess Isabella, Prime Minister Caldwell, Minister of Defense Harrison, and Captain Thornfield. The atmosphere was tense as Thornfield briefed them on the morning's events. "Viktor Kozlov is not someone we can ignore," Thornfield concluded. "His background suggests he has both the capability and the motivation to carry out a serious attack." Isabella listened to the briefing with growing alarm and anger. "So this man threatened our family, and your solution is to lock me away even more than usual?" "Isabella," her father said sternly, "this is not the time for teenage rebellion. This is about your safety and the stability of the monarchy." "But don't you see?" Isabella stood up, her green eyes flashing. "This is exactly why people like Viktor Kozlov exist. We're so isolated from our people that we don't understand their struggles, and they see us as irrelevant at best and enemies at worst." Queen Vivian reached out to touch her daughter's arm. "Sweetheart, your intentions are good, but the situation is more complex than you realize." "Then, explain it to me." Isabella's voice cracked with emotion. "Stop treating me like a child and help me understand what's really happening in our kingdom." Prime Minister Caldwell cleared his throat. "Your Highness, if I may. The refugee crisis has created significant economic pressure on our nation. We're spending approximately 40% more on social services than our budget allows, and that money has to come from somewhere. So we're cutting programs that our own citizens depend on to help refugees from Valdoria," Isabella said, beginning to grasp the political implications. "In essence, yes. And that has created resentment among some segments of the population who feel that the monarchy is prioritizing foreigners over citizens." Minister of Defense Harrison leaned forward. "There's also the security aspect, Your Highness. Intelligence suggests that some of the refugees may not be who they claim to be. There could be Valdorian agents or even terrorists among them." Isabella sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. Everything she had learned about being a princess had emphasized duty, compassion, and service to her people. But now she was discovering that those values sometimes conflicted with practical realities in ways she had never imagined. "What does Viktor Kozlov want from me specifically?" she asked quietly. Thornfield exchanged glances with the king before answering. "Based on his message and our intelligence, he wants you to make a public statement about the refugee crisis. Specifically, he wants you to visit the camps and advocate for continued support, regardless of the cost to the kingdom." "And if I don't?" "Then, he'll likely escalate his tactics until he forces a response." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications. Isabella was caught between her desire to help suffering people and her responsibility to protect her kingdom and family. It was exactly the kind of impossible choice that had broken stronger people than her. As evening approached, the royal family tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Dinner was served in the private dining room, but the conversation was stilted and uncomfortable. Isabella picked at her food, lost in thought about everything she had learned. After dinner, she asked to speak with her parents privately. They gathered in the Queen's sitting room, a more intimate space than the formal study where most royal business was conducted.
"I've been thinking about what Mr. Kozlov said," Isabella began. "About having a choice to make. I think he's right, but not in the way he intended." Her parents waited for her to continue.
"I think my choice isn't between hiding behind these walls or putting myself in danger.
My choice is between being a passive symbol or an active leader." King Edmund frowned. "What do you mean by that?"
"I mean that I can't spend my whole life being protected from the consequences of our family's decisions. If I'm going to inherit this responsibility someday, I need to understand what that really means." Queen Vivian could see where this conversation was heading. "Isabella, you're not ready for that level of responsibility yet.
You're still learning." "When will I be ready, Mother? When I'm 25? 30?
The world isn't going to wait for me to grow up, and our people need leadership now." The king stood up and walked to the window. Outside, he could see the lights of the capital city in the distance. Those lights represented millions of people depending on his family to make the right decisions, and the weight of that responsibility had never felt heavier.
"What exactly are you proposing?" he asked without turning around. "I want to visit the refugee camps."
"Not for a photo opportunity or a ceremonial ribbon cutting, but to really understand what these families are experiencing. And then, I want to work with the government to find solutions that don't abandon either our citizens or the refugees."
"Absolutely not," the king said, turning back to face her.
"The security risk is unacceptable, especially after today's threats."
"Then, increase the security. Bring Captain Thornfield and as many guards as necessary."
"But don't ask me to make decisions about people's lives from the safety of this palace without ever seeing the reality of their situation." Queen Vivian could see the determination in her daughter's eyes, and she recognized the same stubborn streak that had made Edmund a strong king but sometimes a difficult husband. "Edmund," she said softly, "perhaps there's a middle ground we haven't considered." The king looked at his wife with surprise. "Vivian, you can't be seriously considering this." "I'm considering the fact that our daughter is showing the kind of moral courage that this kingdom needs. And I'm also considering that if we don't find a way for her to engage with this crisis constructively, Viktor Kozlov may force the issue in a way that's much more dangerous." As the family continued their discussion late into the night, none of them could have known that Viktor Kozlov and his followers were already planning their next move. The Iron Wolves had established a base of operations in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the capital, and they were preparing for a much more dramatic confrontation with the royal family. The stage was set for a conflict that would test not only the security of the monarchy but also the very principles on which the kingdom of Aldermere had been built. The next morning brought an unseasonable chill to the capital city of Aldermere, as if the weather itself reflected the growing tension that gripped the kingdom. Captain Thornfield stood in the palace war room, studying surveillance footage from the previous day's encounter with Viktor Kozlov. The images were grainy, but they showed clearly that the Iron Wolves were not a ragtag group of protesters. Their positioning had been tactical, their departure coordinated, and their leader's demeanor suggested military training. "Sir," Sergeant Davies entered the room carrying a thick folder.
"Intelligence has compiled everything we have on Kozlov and his organization. It's not encouraging."
Thornfield opened the file and began reading.
"Viktor Kozlov, age 38, former colonel in the Valdorian Special Forces.
His wife Elena and 6-year-old son Mikhail had been killed in a bombing raid during the early days of the Civil War. The attack had targeted a school that was being used as a refugee shelter. Since then, Kozlov had disappeared from official records until he surfaced 6 months ago as the leader of the Iron Wolves." "How many confirmed members does he have?" Thornfield asked.
"At least 50, possibly more.
They've been recruiting heavily among Valdorian refugees and displaced persons across Europe. Their message resonates with people who've lost everything and blame the established governments for failing to prevent the crisis." Thornfield closed the file and looked at the tactical map of the palace grounds spread across the table.
Red pins marked every possible entry point, while blue pins showed guard positions.
It looked secure on paper, but he knew that determined attackers with military training could find ways to exploit even the best defenses. His radio crackled to life.
"Captain, this is gate control. We have Princess Isabella requesting to leave the palace grounds for her morning ride." Thornfield sighed.
Princess Isabella's morning horseback rides through the nearby forest had been a daily routine for years, but, given the current threat level, allowing her to leave the palace seemed incredibly risky.
"Denied," he replied. "Princess Isabella is to remain within the secure perimeter until further notice."
20 minutes later, his radio buzzed again.
"Captain, Princess Isabella is requesting to speak with you personally regarding the riding restriction."
Thornfield made his way to the stables, where he found Princess Isabella grooming her horse, Starlight, a beautiful gray mare she had received for her 15th birthday. The princess was dressed in riding clothes, and her expression made it clear that she was not happy about being confined to the palace. "Your Highness," Thornfield said with a respectful nod.
"Captain, I need you to explain to me why I can't take my usual morning ride."
"The trails are on royal property, and you have guards posted throughout the forest." Thornfield chose his words carefully. "Your Highness, given yesterday's security incident, it would be prudent to maintain tighter protection protocols for the immediate future." Isabella continued brushing Starlight's mane, but Thornfield could see the tension in her shoulders.
"Captain, I understand that you have concerns about my safety.
But I also need you to understand that confining me to this palace is not a long-term solution to whatever problems we're facing.
With respect, Your Highness, my responsibility is your immediate safety, not long-term political solutions."
Isabella turned to face him directly.
"But don't you see how those things are connected? The reason Viktor Kozlov was here yesterday is because people feel disconnected from the royal family. If I become even more isolated, we're just proving his point."
Thornfield was impressed by the princess's reasoning, but his duty was clear.
"Your Highness, isolation is temporary. Death is permanent."
"I'm not asking to wander around the capital unprotected, Captain. I'm asking to continue a routine that I've followed safely for 3 years."
"Surely your men are capable of securing a forest trail."
The captain studied the young woman before him. Princess Isabella had grown up considerably over the past year, and her arguments showed a sophistication that surprised him. But he had seen too much violence in his military career to take unnecessary risks. "I'll consider modifying the security protocols to allow for limited outdoor activities within the palace grounds," he offered. "But the forest trails are off limits until this situation is resolved."
Isabella's jaw set in a stubborn line that reminded Thornfield of her father. "Captain, I'm not a prisoner. And I refuse to be treated like one." Before Thornfield could respond, one of his men approached urgently. "Captain, you're needed in the communications room immediately. We have a developing situation." As they hurried back to the palace, Isabella trailing behind despite Thornfield's suggestion that she return to her quarters, they could hear the unmistakable sound of helicopters approaching. Through the windows, they could see news helicopters circling the palace at a respectful distance, their cameras undoubtedly focused on the royal residence. In the communications room, Minister of Defense Harrison was coordinating with multiple agencies while King Edmund and Queen Vivian looked on with growing alarm. Banks of monitors showed news broadcasts from across Europe, and the headlines were troubling. "Royal family under siege," read one banner. Another proclaimed terrorist threat against Princess Isabella. A third, more sensationally, announced revolution brewing in Aldermere. "How did the media find out about yesterday's incident?" Queen Vivian asked. Harrison looked grim.
"Someone leaked the details to a freelance journalist. The story broke an hour ago and has been picked up by networks across the continent." King Edmund's face was flushed with anger. "I want to know who leaked this information, and I want to know now. This kind of security breach is unacceptable." "Sir," Captain Thornfield interrupted, "with respect, finding the leak is less important right now than managing the current crisis. The media attention changes the tactical situation significantly." On the monitors, they could see that crowds were beginning to gather outside the palace gates. Some carried signs supporting the royal family, while others demanded answers about the refugee crisis. The situation was becoming increasingly volatile. Princess Isabella watched the broadcasts with a mixture of fascination and horror. "Is this really about me?" she asked quietly. "It's about what you represent," Harrison replied. "To some people, you're a symbol of hope and compassion. To others, you represent privilege and disconnection from real-world problems." "And, to Viktor Kozlov," she pressed. Harrison exchanged glances with her parents before answering. "To him, you're a target. Either as leverage to force political changes or as a way to strike a symbolic blow against the monarchy." The weight of this revelation settled on Isabella like a physical burden. She had always known that being a princess carried responsibilities, but she had never fully understood that it could also make her a weapon in other people's political wars. "Your Highness," Thornfield said, "I strongly recommend that you avoid any public appearances for the foreseeable future. The media attention makes you more vulnerable, not less." "But, Captain," Isabella replied, "hiding from the public will only reinforce the narrative that the royal family is out of touch. Don't you see? Every time we retreat, we give Viktor Kozlov exactly what he wants." King Edmund stepped forward. "Isabella, this is not a game. These people are dangerous, and the safety of our family takes precedence over public relations." "Father, I'm not treating this as a game. I'm trying to understand how we can solve the real problem instead of just reacting to symptoms." Before the king could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the palace. Captain Thornfield's radio erupted with urgent voices reporting a security breach at the North Gate. Through the windows, they could see smoke rising from the direction of the main entrance. "All royal family members to the secure bunker immediately," Thornfield commanded, his training taking over. This is not a drill. But, as palace security moved to escort the royal family to safety, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. Instead of following the evacuation protocol, she broke away from the group and ran toward the north wing of the palace, where she could get a clear view of what was happening at the gates. "Isabella!" Queen Vivian screamed, but the princess was already gone, running through corridors she had known since childhood. Thornfield immediately dispatched 2 guards to pursue her while continuing to coordinate the overall security response. The smoke at the North Gate turned out to be a deliberate distraction. Viktor Kozlov had anticipated that the royal family would be moved to the bunker and had used the confusion to position his men closer to the palace. Isabella reached the north wing and pressed herself against a window that offered a view of the main courtyard. What she saw made her blood run cold. The Iron Wolves had somehow breached the outer perimeter and were advancing toward the palace itself. But they weren't charging in with weapons drawn. Instead, they were moving methodically, almost ceremonially, as if they were conducting some kind of ritual. At the head of the group was Viktor Kozlov, carrying something in his hands that Isabella couldn't make out from her position. Behind him, his followers had arranged themselves in formation, and they were chanting something in what sounded like Valdorian. Captain Thornfield's voice echoed through the palace intercom, "All security personnel, this is Code Red. We have hostiles on the grounds. Royal family members are to remain in secure locations. I repeat, this is Code Red." But Isabella wasn't in a secure location, and she had no intention of hiding while people risked their lives to protect her. She had made a decision during those crucial moments when she chose to run toward the danger instead of away from it. She was done being a passive symbol of monarchy. If Viktor Kozlov wanted to make her a part of his political statement, then she would meet him on her own terms. She made her way to the main entrance hall, where she could hear Captain Thornfield coordinating the palace defense through his radio. The Royal Guard had taken defensive positions throughout the building, but their primary objective was protecting the royal family, not engaging in a firefight that could endanger civilians. "Captain," she called out as she approached him. Thornfield turned, his face a mask of professional anger. "Your Highness, you need to be in the bunker with your parents immediately." "Captain, I want to talk to Viktor Kozlov." "Absolutely not. Your Highness, this man is armed and dangerous. He's already demonstrated his willingness to breach royal security, and we have no idea what his ultimate intentions are." "But that's exactly why I need to talk to him," Isabella insisted.
He's here because of me, because of what I represent.
Maybe if I speak with him directly, we can end this without anyone getting hurt. Thornfield's radio crackled with an update from the perimeter guards. Captain, the subjects have stopped advancing and appear to be waiting for something.
Their leader is holding what looks like a flag or banner. Isabella moved to a window where she could see the courtyard.
Viktor Kozlov had indeed stopped his advance and was holding up a large piece of cloth, not a flag, but what appeared to be a child's drawing. Even from a distance, she could make out crude crayon figures that looked like a family.
"What is that?" she asked.
Thornfield raised his binoculars and studied the scene. His expression softened slightly as he realized what they were looking at.
It appears to be a drawing made by a child. Probably his son. The son who was killed in the bombing? Most likely.
Isabella felt her heart constrict as she began to understand what was really happening.
This wasn't just a political demonstration or a terrorist attack.
This was a grieving father trying to make sense of a loss that had destroyed his entire world.
"Captain, I need to speak with him. Not as a princess, but as a human being."
"Your Highness, I cannot allow you to expose yourself to that kind of danger."
"Then, come with me.
Bring as many guards as you want, but let me try to reach him before this escalates into something that gets people killed." Thornfield was facing an impossible decision. His training and instincts told him to maintain the defensive perimeter and wait for reinforcements. But his experience with hostage situations and armed standoffs suggested that sometimes the best resolution came through communication rather than force.
His radio buzzed again. "Captain, we have movement from the refugee camps.
It looks like word of the incident has spread, and people are gathering.
We might be dealing with a much larger crowd soon."
The situation was spiraling beyond a simple security breach. If the refugee population became involved, the potential for violence would increase exponentially. Thornfield realized that he needed to find a way to defuse the immediate crisis before it became something much worse. "Your Highness," he said finally, "if you're serious about speaking with this man, it will be under my terms and with my security protocols. You will wear protective gear, you will have a full escort, and you will follow my instructions without question."
"Agreed."
"And if at any point I determine that the situation has become too dangerous, we withdraw immediately."
"Understood."
As they prepared for what could be the most dangerous conversation of Princess Isabella's young life, neither she nor Captain Thornfield could have anticipated how profoundly it would change not only their own perspectives but the entire future of the Kingdom of Aldermere. 20 minutes later, Princess Isabella emerged from the palace wearing a bulletproof vest under her jacket and flanked by 6 members of the Royal Guard. Captain Thornfield walked slightly ahead of her, his hand resting on his sidearm and his eyes constantly scanning for threats.
Viktor Kozlov watched their approach without moving.
His followers had remained in formation behind him, but Isabella could see that they were tense and ready to react if the situation deteriorated. As she got closer, she could make out more details of the drawing he was holding, stick figures of a man, woman, and small child standing in front of what might have